Now we're going to talk about how we play, the style of front that we play in our base defense, which is what we call a two-gap, one-gap system. A two-gap, one-gap system. Okay. Now the two-gap is kind of a misnomer because we're not actually two-gapping. Okay. We'll talk about that in a second, but we're not actually two-gapping. We are playing the gap from outside in instead of inside out. Okay. Otherwise known as TGOG. So from now on, you'll hear me say TGOG instead of two-gap, one-gap. I'll just say TGOG, TGOG, T-G-O-G, two-gap, one-gap. Okay? In TGOG, we have a deuce defender. Okay, a deuce defender, a deuce player. He is our two-gap player, our pseudo two-gap player. Again, we'll talk about what that means for us in a second. He'll be our pseudo two-gap player. Our jet player is our one-gap player. Okay? This deuce and jet defines the type of technique that we play and what gap we're going to play in our defense. Okay, for a defensive line. Okay? It defines the technique we're going to use, and then it defines what gap we're going to play in our defensive, for our defensive front and our defensive line. Okay? So you'll hear me say TGOG a lot, deuce, and jet. TGOG, deuce, and jet are things you're going to want to remember. Alright. So first we're going to talk about our even front and how these rules apply to that. So, let's say we're in an even right. That sets my three technique to the right. Your technique is determined by whether the gap inside of you is open or closed. Whether the gap inside of you is open or closed. So it's determined by whether or not there is a defender next to you in the adjacent gap. Alright, that determines whether you're a deuce or a jet player. Okay? If there is a defender in your adjacent gap, so if I'm the end, there's a defender in my adjacent gap, I'm a jet player. I'm a jet player. Okay? For jet players, okay, if I'm a jet defender, it means I want to align shoulder tip to the player that I'm on. So if I'm lining up in a 5 on the tackle, I want to be shoulder tip to shoulder tip on that tackle if I'm a jet player. Okay? We always count the ball as a defender. So if I'm the nose, the ball is inside of me, I count that as a defender. I'm also a jet player. If there is no defender inside of me, I'm a deuce defender. So our tackle has no defender inside of him in the A gap, so he's a deuce defender. The end has no defender inside of him, so he's a deuce defender. If I'm a deuce defender, I want to line up eye to eye. So what we call real heavy eye to eye on the player inside of me, the offensive player inside of me. So I'm going to line up eye to eye on the guard, eye to eye on the tackle. Okay. So if I'm a jet defender, I'm going to be loose. I'm going to be shoulder tip to shoulder tip. If I'm a deuce defender, I'm going to be tight. I'm going to be eye to eye. And we always count the ball as a defender. All right. So if I were going to be in a wide front, now, we'd have 2-3 techniques. My ends both have players inside of them, so they'd be a jet player. My tackle, and my nose don't have anybody inside of them, so they're going to be a deuce player. Okay? In our tight front, both the nose and the tackle have the ball inside of them, so they're going to be jet players. Both ends have no one inside of them, so they're going to be deuce players. Okay? And again, we'll talk about jet and deuce technique in a second. Okay? Because their jet and deuce assignment determines their technique. That determines their technique. Okay? Let's go back to how we play a tight end as an end. So if I'm in an even call, let's say we're in an even right again, and I got a tight end, I want to play head up on the tight end. Well, that means I'm going to go and be a deuce player because there's nobody in the gap adjacent from me. So I don't care whether it's an even right or even left call, okay? I just care whether or not there's somebody in the gap adjacent to me. So in this situation, there's no one in the gap adjacent to me because I lined up head up in an 8 technique, so now I'm a deuce defender. So you're not always going to have deuce and jet defenders on both sides of the football. You may have 2 deuce defenders or 2 jet defenders on the same side of the ball. Okay? If he was a wing, he's going to line up in a 7 technique. That means he's inside eye of the wing. Okay? If I'm inside eye of the wing, is there anybody in the gap inside of me? Yes. There's the tackle. So now I become a jet defender. Okay? If I would have lined head up, now there's nobody in that gap inside of me because the gap inside of me is the C gap. Right? But because I'm in the C gap, there's somebody in the B gap. Okay? Let's say now there's a tight end wing. I line up in a tight 9. Okay, I line up in a tight 9. Is there somebody inside of me? No. I'm a deuce defender. I'm a deuce defender. Okay? Remember, away from the 3 technique side, we always line up in a tight 5. So no matter what, I'm going to always be a deuce defender away from the 3 technique side. I'm always going to be a deuce defender 3 technique side. Away from the 3 technique side. Away from the 3 technique side. So to the side of the 2-eye. Okay? I'm always going to be a deuce defender to the away from the 3 technique side. Okay? So an example of that would be, let's say we're in a tight call, and they come out, double tight ends. You got double 2-eyes. Remember, we always line up in a tight 5 away from the 3 technique. There's no 3 tech. Okay? Both our tackles have the ball inside of them, so they're both jet defenders. My ends, they have no one in their adjacent gap. Okay? So they're both deuce defenders. They're both deuce defenders. They're both deuce defenders. You could align everybody head up in what we call a stack alignment. A stack alignment. Okay? A stack alignment. Some teams call it heads. So if I line everybody head up in a stack alignment, okay, so I'll line them up in 2s and 4s. 2s and 4s. Okay? Now, the gap inside of me is open. I'm a deuce. The gap inside of me is open. I'm a deuce. So now we're all deuce defenders. There are no jet defenders. Okay. So, the way in which we determine if we're a deuce or a jet. If the gap inside of me is open, I'm a deuce defender. If the gap inside of me is not open, I'm a jet defender. And we always count the ball as a gap. Okay? We always count the ball as a gap. As a defender in the gap. Okay. So that's how we determine whether or not we're a deuce or jet defender. Okay? And our base defense. Okay? Next, we're going to talk about the differences in technique and gap assignments for deuce and jet defenders.